Good evening to everyone. Glad that you're back, or the faces that I don't recognize, glad that you're here. I was remarking to someone this afternoon about just how tired I get on Sundays. And I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the lack of sleep last night, but this afternoon hit me like a freight train. So I'll try to be lively and excited. Let's begin thinking about some things. We're going to be in Proverbs chapter 1 tonight. Proverbs chapter 1. But I want to think about something before we begin. So we're probably familiar in our culture with the idea of self-help, self-improvement, things like that. Books that provide tips and strategies for maximizing your habits or your financial fluidity, or however you want to say it. There's a lot of stuff out there. The global self-help or self-improvement market in 2024 was around $50 billion. Billion with a B. That is how much people are consuming books and paid podcasts or courses or whatever it is to try to make themselves better in some way. To improve habits, maybe to increase their knowledge in something, or utilize some kind of tool that they feel like they're missing. And I think we all get sucked into this periodically. I go through kind of waves where I think I found, a key to unlocking my productivity or something. And it's nothing new. And it usually doesn't help. But generally, these kinds of products are seeking to improve ourselves. And in a way, if we boil it all down, it's about trying to become wiser. Trying to be wiser and more successful in a variety of areas. And at the end of last week, our group Bible reading for the congregation here began the book of Proverbs. And within the biblical library, if you look at the genres and what they do in the Bible, Proverbs is kind of like the self-help genre of the Bible. There's some things that are really maybe theological about it, but there's also a lot of things that are very practical. If you're in this situation, say this and don't say this. Do this with your money and don't do that with your money. And the goal is generally for increasing wisdom. That's what Proverbs tells us. So tonight we're going to talk about some tips for becoming wiser. These are just general observations about what Proverbs 1 is introducing and teaching, a way for us to help apply what we're reading together. And God has given us this collective of practical advice for improving our lives, and it centers around this idea of wisdom. And so what Daniel read for us just a few moments ago was wisdom speaking to us. Lady Wisdom, as she's personified in the book of Proverbs. Saying to listen to her and to look for her, and what happens if you don't listen to her, and what happens if you do. So tonight I want to take 3 tips from Proverbs chapter 1 as tips of how you can become wiser of what Proverbs is looking or presenting to us. But first let's look at the purpose of the book. So in the first 8 verses here, it reads, "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel." And that is to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing and righteousness, justice and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so this big paragraph, which I've condensed all those lines together, is the purpose statement for the book of Proverbs. This is why it was given to us. If you're looking at it closely, you might notice the repetition of the word to, or maybe the word for in yours. And we have these 6 really purpose clauses telling us what this book is about. So in a way, you can state this: these are the Proverbs of Solomon, and they're given for this, and for this, and for this. If we look at those really quick, it reveals the goals of the Proverbs and what they're about. If you think about what exactly is a proverb, and this is especially, I think, pertinent for those of us who are younger, and maybe we've heard that word and we don't know what it is, these verses reveal what proverbs are intended to do. And proverbs are not unique to the Bible. You might have heard proverbs from people like Confucius, or I think there's Egyptian proverbs that go around. But generally, they're just short, memorable sayings that teach something practical or important. I think that's a good way to define it. It's just something short and memorable that teaches you some kind of piece of advice. And we see in all kinds of ways what they're intended to do. So if we look at these purposes in verses 2 through 6, and you can see that there's the groupings here of verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, 5 kind of stands a little bit on its own, and then verse 6 again. These are what this is about. In verse 2, we see that it's to learn wisdom and understand wise sayings. So you gain a little bit of knowledge, and you try to understand what are all these older, smarter, wiser people talking about. This is an exercise in being able to do that. In verse 3, we see that it's to gain instruction for wise behavior. And that wise behavior is supposed to lead to righteousness, justice, and integrity. You learning about how to act wisely should lead you in this way. In verse 4, it's about giving better judgment to the young and to the naive, helping you make better decisions and be able to navigate situations. In verse 5, we see that it's about teaching and giving advice even to those who are older. In verse 6, to help understand what wiser people are saying. Have you ever been around an older person, maybe a grandparent, and they say something and you think to yourself, I know the words that just came out of your mouth, but I have no idea what you're talking about. And it seems as though that is more common for those of us who had grandparents that grew up in the South. I don't know why. My grandparents are from Arkansas. And my grandfather especially would say things that I've never heard anywhere else on the planet. And I most of the time had no idea what he was talking about. And so the Proverbs helps us to understand those kinds of things. I'm sure Solomon would sit in judgment and give these kinds of instructions, and a lot of people would think about, what is he talking about? And they had to think. You notice that some of the word choices in these few verses about discretion and thinking and all of those kind of ideas, you put this together, and these are things that we're supposed to meditate on. It's not going to come right away. It's not going to click immediately all the time, but they're things to ponder, to meditate, to try to understand what the import is. And in addition to these purposes, we're also given who Proverbs are for. Now, Proverbs are for everybody. In verses 4 and 5, as we remarked a little bit, in verse 4, to give prudence to the simple and knowledge and discretion to the youth. So Proverbs are for young people, those who are inexperienced and maybe a little bit more naive, so that they can be instructed and gain some advice. But it's not just for young people either. It's for those who are older. In verse 5, let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. So even if we are already wise, there's something to be gained from listening and being instructed as we are in the Proverbs. And after listing the purposes and the goals of these Proverbs, we're introduced to really what is the central theme of the entire book. This is the assumption that is underneath everything that is said in the Proverbs, and that is verse 7. Your Bible might actually even have it kind of hanging by itself, because that's to draw attention that this is something important here. And what is said is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so there's really this two-part thing going on here. The fear of the Lord as knowledge, and then those who reject it. And that is what a fool is in the wisdom literature. It's not somebody who's stupid. It's somebody who has willingly chosen to go the other way. That's who a fool is, according to the Psalms and the Proverbs and so on. So we're going to look at this in a little bit more depth in a few moments. But this communicates the principle that if you're trying to learn anything from these, and if you truly want to be wiser, this is where it begins. A respect for God, trying to understand and know what He is expecting. And there are actually similar words of these said elsewhere in the Bible. This is not unique to Proverbs. So for instance, in Job chapter 28, and in verse 28, it says, "And he said to man, Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding." And there's similar things said in the Psalms. I believe Psalm 111, for instance, and things in Ecclesiastes where this same concept is given throughout the wisdom literature of if you want to really understand anything about the world and become wiser, it starts here by respecting God. And that leads us really to our first tip that we're going to talk about. And that is start by honoring God's guidance. You want to become wiser, then start here, honoring God's guidance. And so that pulls us back into verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. So the author first mentions here this concept of the fear of the Lord. And for a lot of us, this phrase probably gives us maybe a little bit of apprehension. Am I supposed to be afraid of God? Well, there's a sense in which God is a powerful being and we should respect Him and His power and His authority, of course. But there is a lot more to this concept than simply just being afraid. I don't think that's what it's really talking about. If you look at the usage of the word, it points to a deep respect and a reverence for God. And that's what the fear of the Lord is about. It's about a deep respect, a reverence, sometimes a piety toward whatever the object of that fear is. And so if you look this word up in a lexicon or a dictionary, some possible translations in different contexts are reverence, fear as we have here, but also worship and awesomeness. And that gives you a full idea of what this can do in different contexts. There's one definition that's noted as it's stated here, that this is a deep state of piety or respect. That's what the fear of the Lord is. It is a deep respect for who God is. I believe it was one commentator said something to the effect of, the fear of the Lord is about respecting God as God and letting Him stand where He belongs. This is about acknowledging who God is and letting Him have His proper place in our lives. If you want to understand the world, if you want to be able to function well in the world that He created, then you have to give Him His proper place. The beginning of becoming wiser is honoring God in His instruction. And so that's what we see. You honor God, that's the beginning of knowledge and understanding the way that things are. And the counterpart to that, if you want to be a fool, if you don't want to be wise, then you can despise wisdom and instruction. You can refuse to be taught anything. You can go the other way and not respect God and not take His guidance that He's willing to provide for you. And that is the other alternative. I think everyone in this room would probably say, of course, I respect God and I let Him have His place and I respect His guidance. I take His guidance. But as I was thinking about this and talking through it with another person a few days ago, a lot of us say this intellectually, but how much do we apply it practically? And so a quotation from a book that I'm working through with someone else said this about just this general idea. And they talk about it in the concept of surrender. So surrendering the reins of our life is not easy. We have to face our arrogant thinking and realize that although we believe in God, we have not allowed him into our lives in a real and practical way. And that's what they were talking about. We say a lot of times, yeah, I believe in God and I follow his instruction, but when it comes to the practical day-to-day details, how often are we actually putting that into practice? It's about giving God control. Letting him have control over my life instead of me trying to hold on to it. I'm going to follow his guidance. And that's not just abstractly, but that's practically as well. And the And look, for instance, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without reason, like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and it goes on to all of this. And so we've talked about in verse 7, let God guide you and give him the proper place in your life. And it turns immediately to do not follow other people who do these kind of things. And so really the central lesson in this part of chapter 1, or another tip for becoming wiser, is avoid people who do evil things. So the first one is accept God's guidance and then avoid people who do evil things. So let's look at some of what is said here in chapter 1. We'll start in verse 11. It says, "If they say, 'Come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and whole like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all precious goods. We shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot among us, and we will have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. For in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird. But these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. Such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessors." And so time is taken to set out this point. Don't follow these kind of people. If you want to be wise, don't fall in with this crowd. And so we saw in verse 10, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If people are trying to draw you into something, don't give into it. We see in verse 15, don't walk with them, don't follow their paths. This is the antithesis to what God is providing in his instruction. And so this is the way of the fool, of rejecting instruction, of doing these evil things. So there will be influence, and verse 19 communicates the idea of people who live in this way are really kind of sucking the lives out of themselves. That way of life is just, in a practical standpoint, not beneficial. It's not going to help you. It's not going to benefit you in any way. And this really reminded me of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, which is in some ways the New Testament counterpoint to this. Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. Now, I believe he's quoting possibly a Greek poet here, but this is another proverb that is true. And this is something that reflects what God has taught. Don't be deceived. Don't go in this way. Don't get tricked into this. Bad company ruins good morals. So there's a real danger of being deceived. If Paul has to say, don't be tricked into this, that's because we can easily become tricked and think, maybe I'll turn them around. Maybe I won't be influenced. I think this is especially important for those of us who are younger and those of us who have been teenagers at any point. Can remember that pull of peer pressure, of trying to be influenced to do things, and sometimes you have the gut feeling not to do it, but you do it anyway, and you see how easily we can be pulled away from this. And with what the Proverbs talking about, and with what Paul's talking about here, we're not talking about people who just make mistakes. That's not what it is. It's not avoid people who make honest mistakes. It is those who intentionally choose the wrong way and who want to do evil things when they know better, who are rejecting instruction and choosing to do evil instead of good. That is who we're talking about here. That is who the wisdom literature calls the fool. The person who knows the right thing to do and rejects that and wants to do something else. So if you look at chapter 1 there and you look at what these people are saying, they know better. They're doing it in secret. They're hiding. They're filling their houses with other people's gain. There's all kinds of things that they're doing. And this is not just about people who make mistakes here. And so then the Proverbs out of the gate tell us what to avoid, and that's the influence of evil people. Let God guide you. Avoid the influence of evil people. And so we know what to avoid, but what do we pursue? As if you've ever had this experience where you try to cut out something, and then if you don't replace it, a vacuum is created. And something is going to rush in there to replace it. So what do we pursue instead of the way of the fool? And that is our last tip of what we're going to talk about tonight. The tip for becoming wiser is seek out wisdom intentionally. And that is what we see here in Proverbs chapter 1. Seek out wisdom intentionally. In verses 20 through 21, for instance, and this is what Daniel read for us earlier, wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the markets, she raises her voice. The market's the idea of the center of town, like a town square. At the head of the noisy street, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. So wisdom is here, and she's calling to people, and she wants people to come and to learn and to be instructed and to become wiser. And so the idea is if you look for it, you'll find it. It's there. You just have to be intentional. Instead of following the way of those people, listen to the call of wisdom. Go the way that she is calling you to. And this reminded me of something in Jeremiah. And in this, I don't believe, the verse before this is that really famous one that you see on a lot of coffee mugs. For I know the plans I have for you. That's this context here. But what this is Jeremiah is sending a letter to the remaining elders that are still living but in captivity in Babylon. And this is what God is saying to them. When he brings them back, then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You'll seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. But I want you to zero in on that verse 13. If you seek me, you will find me when you look with all your heart. Check this, and God says this sort of in multiple places, and this is the same kind of advice that David gives to Solomon, interestingly enough. David tells Solomon, if you look for the Lord, he'll be there, but if you reject him, then he's going to reject you. And so I started to wonder maybe where Solomon got some of this advice from. But we see here, if you look for God, if you search for wisdom, it's going to be there. It reminds me of, I think, a verse that pops into my head maybe more often than any other, and that's Hebrews 11:6 that a lot of you will be familiar with, which reads, and without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. If you look for God, if you intentionally try to go his way and accept his guidance, he's going to reward you for that. And that is a promise that he gives. As he told the captives here, if you look for me with your heart, you'll find me. You'll find wisdom. You won't come away empty-handed. And this is sort of similar to the promise that we see at the end of chapter 1. It says, for the simple are killed by their turning away. And so the idea of the fool going the opposite way of wisdom and instruction. And the complacency of fools destroys them, but whoever listens to me will dwell secure. There is reward, there is benefit. And I forgot that it divided that quotation. So the rest of that sentence reads, and will be at ease without dread of disaster. And so there's a promise. If you want to become wiser and you follow this guidance, there's a reward. Your life is going to be better. God has given us wisdom, and he provides us things for us to meditate on and to grow by and to practically import into our lives and to make a difference. It's interesting for me to read just really any kind of literature. And every so often you're reading a random book and you'll see a proverb from this book of Proverbs just thrown in there. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with spirituality. But people recognize the value of what has been provided throughout millennia through these proverbs. So these are really the tips that were given in Proverbs chapter 1 for becoming wiser. This is really kind of how you listen to the voice of the Proverbs and you seek what it is trying to give you. Honor God's guidance. Avoid people who do evil. and seek out wisdom. And you look at that and you're like, wow, that's good advice. That's practical. That's something I can use. And that's the kind of book that it is. And so I hope we can see those things as we're continuing to read through it in this season. I think we'll finish it here in a couple weeks because then we still have Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes. So in the next couple weeks, look for these kind of things and understand those themes. Look for more tips, things that you can apply. And that's really what we're talking about with tips. What is something that I can take today and apply to my life? So this is what I wanted to talk about today, but of course, as we always extend, there is an invitation for anyone who's listening. So we've been talking about this idea of wisdom, and wisdom that God has provided and that he has given to instruct us. And it is a fundamental point that God does not want you to be in the dark. He doesn't want you to be ignorant. He wants you to understand his will and his plans and to provide for you to learn and to grow. And so if you're curious at all, or if you're on that path and want to know the next thing to do, then there's an invitation for you. Of course, tonight, tomorrow, whenever it is, God wants you to understand who he is and what he expects of you in that relationship. So if we can help you to do that in any way, then let us know as we stand in